Well, in tonight's essay, the League of Gentlemen writer and novelist Jeremy Dyson takes us back to the magical wonder of his childhood, inspired by the unique Leeds arcade clocks and magnificent carvings of Leeds Central Library.
It's hard to remember it now, but once upon a time Leeds was a fairy tale place, full of enchantment and wonder. I'm not arguing the case that Yorkshire's largest city was like something from a fable, a Lilliput or a Camelot, but I am speaking the truth, as it was for me. When I was no more than 5 or 6 years old, I'd be taken into town by Mum on Thursday afternoons, because Thursday was shopping day. Marks and Spencer's downstairs, where the food was. Silvio's for cream cakes that came in a ribboned cardboard box. And then Schofield's, a department store of seemingly limitless size, where Mum would try on clothes or buy lipsticks which she tested on the back of her hand in big pink smears. All this was tolerable enough, pleasant even. But there was a greater promise outside, beyond the curtains of hot air that blew down from the fans above the double doors. It was just across the road, in the Thorntons Arcade. With its big red sign and high-arched entrance, there wasn't anything obviously beguiling about the place. A large covered passageway that led from Land's Lane to Briggate. On either side of its stone-flagged floors were rows of shops with unpromising names, like Kay's Shoes, Sew and Save, and Ray Allen's Menswear. But the truth was that the location held something magical, incredible beyond words. It was like a giant toy displayed halfway up the wall for everyone to see. All you had to do was look up. "Mum, Mum, is it time yet? Is it time?" You see, you had to be there exactly on the hour. But if you were, a dream would come alive for you, right there, before your very eyes. I had at that time a favourite television programme called Camberwick Green. I would stand there watching it, motionless, captured by the wonder. It began every week with a musical box from which figures would rise and wave hello. Mechanisms that came to life by themselves always enchanted and thrilled me. But it was one thing to watch something on the television, whose contents might be magical, but they were still at one remove, sealed behind glass, trapped in 2 dimensions. They might well intrude into my imagination, but they didn't penetrate the world itself. It was another thing entirely to stand in this shopping arcade, which itself was a semi-magical space, being both inside and outside at the same time, with shops and a pavement, but also a roof. To stand there and look up and see, high upon the wall over the westerly entrance, something like a stage with characters on it, and above them a huge black cast-iron clock. The figures gathered beneath it were life-sized. 3 of the 4 were bare-legged. It looked like they were wearing ladies' nighties, despite the fact that they were men. 2 of them had swords, one a big bow and arrow which was too large for the stage and poked out in front of it. Their legs were pink, and they each stood next to a bronze bell which they pointed at with an upraised fist. Despite the fact that they were painted in lifelike colours, I could see that these were statues. They stood immobile, frozen in slightly odd positions, unless, that is, you were there at exactly the right time. Because if you gathered beneath them precisely on the hour as the clock's heavy iron long hand swung lazily towards the 12, or the X11 as these were Roman numerals, then magic happened, and the figures came alive. The man in the green nightie with the 2 big bow and arrow, his free arm would begin to swing, his fist jerked, and he struck the bell, firmly, authoritatively, defiantly even. His friend on the opposite side, who wore a leopard print chemise just like my Grandma Dyson's, he joined in with his higher pitched bell, striking out a rising and falling pattern of surprising loudness. I would stand there, transfixed, amazed, fascinated, filled with wonder. What was this magic halfway up the wall, happening before my very eyes? Why was it there? As if this wasn't enough, there was even more wonder to be had, a 5-minute walk up the road. Because there was another arcade, nestling between the Tower Cinema and the Grand Theatre from which it took its name, the Grand Arcade. Ironically, it was not quite as grand as the Thorntons. Even as a small child, I was somehow attuned enough to my mother's sensibilities to know that this was the less fancy end of town. But its clock was even better. Perhaps it was gaudier than the one with the stately figures down the road. These statues resided in a painted castle with 2 wooden doors, flanked by silvered knights in armour. The whole thing looked like a life-size toy fort, and as with the other clock, the knights here came to life and struck the hour via 2 hanging bells, using their little battle axes rather than their fists. But that was just the beginning. Because then came a procession of 5 other figures of increasing strangeness. The first was a soldier, the second wore a kilt, the third a bright green jacket, the fourth held what looked like a large brush, and the fifth wore only a loincloth and turban. They each in turn saluted or bowed to their audience, presumably even if there was no audience there, before disappearing into a dark, shadowed doorway. Even at this very young age, I knew that there were other places in Leeds that shared the magical quality of these animated timepieces. There was Roundy Park with its mysterious hedge maze and stone-carved water fountains. And there was the Central Library with its numerous stone animals, an impossibly high vaulted wooden ceiling, like a castle full of books, lined throughout with gorgeous multicoloured tiles and mosaics. It was simultaneously sober, quiet, serious, and exuberantly wild and wonderful. Little did I know that these places which so transported me were actually connected by one man. His name was John Wormold Appleyard, and he was a sculptor, born and buried in Leeds. The Thornton's Arcade was named after its builder, Charles Thornton, a successful brewer and licensed victualler who also owned the City Varieties Music Hall at the top of the hill. The arcade was erected on the site of the old Talbot Inn, which had been renowned for its cockfighting in the 17th century. Thornton wanted a clean sweep. His new construction would speak to family values and the more salubrious enterprises of commerce and retailing. The icing on his cake was to be the clock, manufactured by the internationally famous William Potts and Sons, who supplied timepieces to public buildings, churches, and railway stations all around the world. But their expertise was purely mechanical. When it came to the figures who would adorn the design, they turned to John Wormold Appleyard, who was a renowned stonemason, having been apprenticed to his grandfather from the age of 9. The figures in nighties were carved in wood, however, and they weren't actually wearing nighties. They were, in fact, characters from Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe. They were attired in traditional medieval dress. That was Robin Hood with the big bow and arrow, and Gurth the swineherd in the leopard print, which presumably was derived from some other spotted animal, leopards not being native to the forests of Ashby. The 1870s were a busy time for Appleyard, and his work adorned some of the city's most visited public spaces. It was he who was responsible for all the extraordinary stonework in Leeds Central Library, and the beautiful structure that houses the drinking fountains in Roundy Park. All of these artefacts are still there today, and if you should be passing, please take a minute to step inside the Central Library on the Hedgerow, next to the Town Hall. I promise you that you'll be floored by the intricacy of the carving on display, and the allure of the mythical creatures that cling to the stone banisters upon every return. They made a statement to my younger self. They seemed to say that even here in this most serious of municipal buildings, there is magic to be found. And for those cynics who might say that the presence of these clocks in the shopping arcades was not down to any altruistic urge, that rather the artefacts were included merely in the hope that they would attract more visitors to the premises, and therefore perhaps allow for larger rents to be charged, well, those sceptics would have to concede that the same couldn't be said of the lions and rampant dogs carved into the stonework of the Central Library. There were no paying customers there. The art was a gift to the citizens of Leeds, and to this day, despite their delicacy and their value, they're not in glass cases or raised high on plinths. They're right next to you as you climb the stairs. You can reach out and touch them, caress them even. No one will stop you. If one looks around at the equivalent public spaces and buildings being erected today, it quickly becomes clear that whatever urge there once was to spiritualise and enchant the agora for the well-being and the delight of the public has long since vanished. Even something as vast and well-funded as a Westfield does not contain anything as simple and magical as the Ivanhoe clock. and there is no recent public building anywhere in the country that would give its visitors as generous an endowment as John Appleyard's multiple dogs and lions, snuffling their way up 4 flights of stone stairs to lead generations of children, and the rest of us, willingly into the cathedral of knowledge that waited at the top. The argument is often made that it's all very well looking to the example of the Victorian age, but that these things were much cheaper then, and therefore such fripperies could be indulged. In fact, according to a study made by academic Michael Benedict, the exact opposite was true. Relatively speaking, artefacts such as those carved by Appleyard's hand would have been much more expensive. They absorbed more of our then wealth, time and income, so that's not the explanation for their disappearance from our public spaces. It's much more to do with a major shift in the culture and our understanding of the depths of ourselves. Increasingly across the last century, particularly from the post-war period onwards, what counts is what you can count. This attitude has compounded in my lifetime to the point now where university degrees are quite shamelessly ranked by what they might earn you monetarily in your working life. Enlightenment, enchantment, and even education for its own sake are at best irrelevant, at worst a wasteful indulgence. The child within me who is shaped by these generously and fantastically endowed spaces wants to plead otherwise. My writing career was ignited by these experiences. The magic I found in them, the magic that was quite intentionally gifted to me by Mr. Appleyard and the burghers of Leeds who commissioned him, so inspired me that there are not 1 but 2 stories in my first published book of fiction directly related to these earliest memories. The awareness of the magic all around me, the encouraged perception that enchantment and wonder were threaded alongside the everyday, running like a lively spring or stream through the city's streets and buildings, bubbling away right next to the commerce, the learning, the knowledge, and the everyday business of being, made it clear that this phenomenon was in itself as valuable and important and as necessary as anything that might be found in the shops or on the shelves of the library. It enriched my life every day. A recent and uncomfortable visit to the dentist reminded me that when a tooth has had its nerve removed, it can be preserved and maintained for a time. But often it will become brittle and crack, and then ultimately crumble, because without its feeling, it's not truly alive. All too often I look at the society that we once had and think it's become like that tooth. The nerve has been taken out, and now it's crumbling. If we can modify everything, if we only value that which we can count, we diminish what we might be in ways we simply cannot fathom. It's not just a matter of questioning materialism. It's about the unlocking of human potential. Of course, I only have my own life to go on, but I know for sure that this leavening of the quotidian with the wonderful and the magical that I gained from the public spaces of Leeds as a child has fed into every aspect of my writing career. From the wild absurdities of the streets of Royston Vasey and the League of Gentlemen, to the themes of enchantment in everyday life in my short stories, and the theatrical magic of the play ghost stories. All of these were fueled by the sense of wonder quickened by these earliest demonstrations that magic was to be found first and foremost in the everyday. If our informationally overloaded, technologically saturated, spiritually desiccated world needs anything now, it is much more of that. Time and tide wait for no man, says the legend painted beneath the grand arcade clock. Please let's not wait until it runs out altogether.
The essay was written and read by Jeremy Dyson. The producer was Polly Thomas, and it was a Thomas Carter project for BBC Radio 3. Tomorrow night, the poet Michelle Scally-Clark brings us her view of both arms, the 16-metre-high bronze commemorating Nelson Mandela's visit to Leeds in 2001.
Hello, I'm Felix Glieser and I play the French horn. Normally a French horn player has his right hand in the bell, and for me, of course, having no arms, the biggest problem was to find a way to sound like a horn player sounds with a hand in the bell. In this series, I want to tell you how playing the French horn has shaped my life, and I want to share with you as much great music as I can.
Round the Horn with Felix Glieser. Listen on BBC Sounds.
This is BBC Radio 3 on 90 to 93 FM, digital radio, BBC Sounds and on your smart speaker. Just ask for BBC Radio 3. It's 11 o'clock.
Hello and welcome to BBC Radio 3's Night Tracks, an hour and a half of late night listening, which begins with a gentle guitar miniature by Gia Margaret. That was Gia Margaret playing guitar, piano and synths in a muted track called Guitar Piece. And this is Night Tracks on Radio 3. I'm Sarah Moore-Peach, with you until midnight. And there's more guitar music coming up in just a moment from Khaki King. But first, music by Michael Barclay, whose spoken voice you might well recognise as host of the Radio 3 show Private Passions. But Michael is also a composer, and this is a still life for oboe and harp. It's influenced by the understated music of Erik Satie.